As you all know, we have over 300 miles of canal system. And the 300 miles of canal system can get a little bit complex and a little confusing and that sort of thing. And the most complex and confusing part of it is actually Jones Creek and Oyster Creek. And if you look at the top left of your slide, you'll see an A, B, and C. And I hate to try and describe what color green that is, but I'll just go ahead and go with A, B, and C. A is the Shannon Pump Station, and between A and B is Jones Creek. And B is the old second lift, and it's, by the way, that is a term that is left over from the 1940s because there hasn't been an actual old second lift since the 1940s. And from B to C is Oyster Creek, and C being the second lift. And now we're going to zoom in a little bit. Again, A, B, and C, A and B and C all being the same. You have on the left the Jones Creek area, and on toward the center in red, Oyster Creek. Next slide. And let's zoom in a little bit closer on Jones Creek. And what I'm going to do is take you essentially on a virtual tour of Jones and Oyster Creek and describe for you how this system works. And then we're going to come back and look at Jones Creek again, because Jones Creek actually has some controversy that's associated with it. And I think it's real important that you are aware of the issues associated with it and so forth. So next slide. So Jones Creek, the section between A and B that we talked about, and I've got again A and B pointed out on those maps. Jones Creek is primarily what you see in green running through there, and it's a whole lot more complex than the maps that you're used to seeing if you've seen any of those couple of maps we showed you just a short bit ago. And so just to walk you through that a little bit, from A to where it just turns upward a short distance, that is our canal that feeds into Jones Creek. And Jones Creek, the first part of it is just a little bit less than 3 miles, or a little bit less than 4 miles of Jones Creek that runs into, and you'll notice a red creek that comes in from the top. That is Fluellen Creek. And Fluellen Creek is going to be real important, and we will talk about that in a great deal more detail here in a short bit. And then from Fluellen Creek, you can see winding all the way through there is 15 miles worth of canal length that gets you to the Jones Creek Spillway on the right. And it's that Jones Creek Spillway, you can see it's just below the B. And then there is a purple area in there that we're going to refer to as Dolly's Gully. And then B, where that B is right there, is the location of the old second lift. In an area that we refer to as the old second lift, but I also refer to it as the Skinner Gates. And we'll show that in a great deal more detail here in a short bit as well. So let's move to the next one. Eric gave you a little bit of an update on the Shannon plant and so forth, and how it functions and what is what. But just to reorient you a little bit, I want to tell you a couple of things about the Shannon plant, because it's real important how the staff operates this. You have several folks at the Canal Division, David Sauer being one, Brenda being another one, and David Hudson and several other staff members in there. And they have to anticipate water needs and flow in that river at least a week in advance. And David Sauer and others have essentially a periodic, usually weekly phone call with all of the users in the lower Brazos area, where they coordinate the amount of water that is being taken. And then I'm just going to tell you very briefly what Brenda does. She does what's called water accounting. And let me tell you, it's shocking how remarkably complex that is, because she has to tell the folks how much water we are going to take, and she has to do it a week in advance, and then she has to tell them how much we really took, etc. I'm not going to spend any more time on this, but I could spend about an hour talking to you about water accounting. It's very complex. So this is the Shannon plant intake. on the right, and we've talked about earlier today about Shannon plant intake. On the left, you can see it as well, and the white building itself on the left is the pump station pumping into the canal system. And a couple of things that I want to point out to you about that is the Shannon pump station was originally built in 1908. And one of the reasons it's so remarkably important is that we are permitted for just under 100,000 acre-feet per year of run-of-the-river water. And so if there's water out there in the river, we can take up to almost 100,000 acre-feet. And that 100,000 acre-feet is senior water rights. It's actually dated back to January 15th of 1926. And that's remarkably important because the older the water right, the more claim you have on it. And it's such an old water right, it actually predates the Brazos River Authority. And so we actually have the right for water to pass through essentially the dams of the Brazos River Authority to come to us, and we have senior rights on that. So next slide. So this is the downstream portion of the Shannon plant. So on the left, you see head walls, and if you look real close, you'll see these big flap gates and so forth. Well, water comes out of those big flap gates, and then on your right, it shows the actual canal system where the water gets put into and moves on down the system. So next slide. Along this canal system is the TCEQ meter flume. And so water passes through here, and there is a device in here that measures the actual amount of water that we turn around and report to the TCEQ for their accounting purposes as well. So next slide. So as we move down a little bit, we're now in Jones Creek itself. And you'll recall that I pointed out Fluellen Creek with you. This is the actual confluence with Jones Creek. And so just a little less than 4 miles down Jones Creek, we run into Fluellen Creek. And then you're looking downstream, Jones Creek continues on for 15 miles or so. So continue on. So this is an actual view of Jones Creek itself. This is not our canal. This is actually Jones Creek, and it's below FM 359. And next. So then you run into a few bridges that are not FM bridges and so forth. And so this is the Pecan Street Bridge. And a downstream view of it, and that's the actual Pecan Street Bridge itself. They call it a bridge. It's, of course, a culvert system. And this is fairly typical as to what the system looks like. And by the way, I want to point out that David Sauer has mentioned to me that if we did not pump water into Jones Creek would primarily be dry. There's not a lot of flow that goes through there, and the little bit of flow that does go through there when it's not raining is a little bit of wastewater treatment plant flow. And actually, he gets calls of complaints when we don't have water running through there. So it's actually a very beneficial thing, not only for our own purposes, but for others. And so this represents, by the way, this flow represents about a little over 100 cubic feet per second. So we have in the pump station itself, we have two 50,000 gallon per minute pumps and one 40,000 gallon per minute pump. Well, if you do a little math, the 50,000 gallon per minute pump gives you 110 cubic feet per second, and that's a fairly typical flow that we have going through there. Next. So this is again the Cedar Creek Bridge. Can continue on. So here is a little bit of a problem, and we're going to come back to this after we do the full tour of the system and talk about it. But on June 26, 2010, that's what the bridge looked like. And it has caused a great deal of concern. And this is the Cedar Creek Bridge as well. And so you can move to the next one. After you get past this particular neighborhood, you get into the place where it gets a little bit complex to describe. So this is going to take me just a moment, and this is not the only view that you'll see of it, but I think it's important for you to see an aerial of it as we start. So one of the things that we run across is that the Jones Creek spillway, which is shown essentially in the orange box. We have a spillway that is in place, and it actually is fairly recently reconstructed. It's about 7 feet tall and has a 65-foot wide spillway that's associated with it. And its purpose is to hold water back. And what it does is it holds water back and goes up what is called Dolly's Gully. And Dolly's Gully is almost totally flat, and it takes it up to the Skinner Lane gates. Now I'm gonna take you through a couple of more slides to get you to where you can see this in a little bit more detail as to where it is, because it's a little hard to imagine on these aerial photos. So again, we are in the area where there is a B on the right. So between the Jones Creek Spillway and the old second lift area. So let's go to the next slide. This next slide is actually with the aerial photo turned off. So again, you see the Jones Creek Spillway. What that does is it blocks and holds water back in Jones Creek. And there is a little trailing bit that goes off to the south from the Jones Creek Spillway. That's actually a continuation of Jones Creek. Moving backwards, kind of to the southeast of the Jones Creek Spillway, is the Dolly's Gully area. As I mentioned, it's almost completely flat, and its purpose is really to push water back up to the Skinner gates. And what this whole structure does is it moves water from Jones Creek into very separate Oyster Creek. And in this area, the reason we call it the old second lift is there actually used to be a pump station in this area, but that pump station hasn't been there since 1940. And so that provides a little bit, I think, of the confusion as well. And so let's go to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. This is the actual Jones Creek Spillway itself, and so you're looking upstream there on the right. That's the continuation of Jones Creek, and it's water coming down as we've been pumping it. On the left is what it looks like below the spillway. There's not very much water going through that at all. And then in the middle, you can see the bottom of it. Go to the next slide. This is the Jones Creek Spillway on that date that I showed you before with the floodwaters running through. And so from time to time, it goes from nice docile Jones Creek into this. And so I think it's very important for you to look at. And by the way, one of the things that I think has been a little bit of confusion is that the downstream area of Jones Creek, some of the residents who actually even know it exists down there call it an escape channel. And I think that there is some confusion on that we'll talk about here in just a minute as well. But in summary for Jones Creek, this is the old second lift area, consists of the Jones Creek Spillway, where we back up water to Dolly's Gully, to the Skinner water floodgates, the Skinner water gates. And by the way, these are not floodgates. And its whole purpose is to transition water from Jones Creek into separate Oyster Creek. And so let's go to the next slide. This is the actual Skinner gates themselves. And on the left is what the Skinner gates looked like when I first came to work here. And they had been there for quite some time. And they didn't function as well as we would like for them to. And we have turned around and since replaced those. And they consist of 5 sets of 48-inch pipe. And those gates themselves, by the way, we have a partnership with the Lower Colorado River Authority, where we put in orders for gates from time to time, and they actually build them for us, and those are those gates. So let's move to the next slide. So this is the actual discharge from the Skinner gates. And by the way, how we operate this is also a source of significant neighborhood confusion. And once we get through this tour, I'll come back to it. The next slide. Okay, so we're now at a part where the old second lift, or the green area, transitions into the red area. And so once we have gotten here, we're now into Oyster Creek. So next slide. We have a customer that's fairly close downstream of this, and that's Pecan Grove. And we actually have a contract where we move Pecan Grove's water for them, their own water, through our system. And they use about 1.6 million gallons a day. And that 1.6 million gallons a day is going to be important for us to remember when we get back to the system as well. So moving on. So this is Pecan Grove's take point. And then we get further down Oyster Creek, you get into the Long Meadow Farm area and the Harvest Green area. You can see one of our drag lines in there. We've been doing some cleaning in this picture there and stacking dirt on the bank, which we either spread out from time to time or we cooperate with adjacent owners who may want this dirt to do some fill with. So moving to the next slide. As we continue on down Oyster Creek, we run past Aliana and the old Central Prison site and so forth, and it continues on till we get to the Sugar Land Take Point. And so this is where Sugar Land's water treatment plant pulls water out of our system as an upstream and downstream view, and Sugar Land on average uses about 9.6 million gallons a day. And from about here on, Oyster Creek really becomes a great big complex and a very, very long reservoir, and it's actually a permitted reservoir. And so this map is really pretty complex, and we'll come back to it a time or two, so this won't be the last time you see it. But up on the top left, you see an arrow that points to Dam 1. And to orient you a bit, that is Highway 6 and Alt 90, or to orient you a little bit more, Dam 1 is directly south of Sugar Land's baseball field, Constellation Field, I believe is what it's called. And so you'll see that, and there is a thing called the Ditch H overflow, and that's real important. That Ditch H overflow allows floodwaters that come down Oyster Creek to have an escape, and it goes right straight to the Brazos River. And so you may also remember us talking quite a lot about the Brooks Weir. Also, you may hear us refer to it as the old term Emil Gates. Well, the water spills out in that area as well from a flood control perspective. And then as you move on down the system, you run into Dam 2 and you run into Dam 3 and the second lift. And I'm not sure all of you are aware of this. Those constant level amenity lakes that are in Sugar Land, well, that's actually the Gulf Coast Water Authority's water running through those amenity lakes. So let's move to the next slide. So this is the actual Ditch H overflow structure. And what happens with this, as I mentioned before, is the water gets up in Oyster Creek. It actually has the ability to escape directly to the Brazos River through this particular system. And let's move on to the next one. We run into Dam 1, and Dam 1 is immediately south of Constellation Field, as I mentioned, and it is actually it's actually not operational at this time. And so I'm going to have a little bit of a discussion with City of Sugar Land as to whether or not it really needs to continue to exist. And then this is a view up and downstream of Oyster Creek Dam number 1. And then this is the Brooks Weir, otherwise formerly known as the Emil Gates. This is a joint project that we have with the City of Sugar Land, and it's a flood control structure. So here you have the downstream view of it, and let's move on. And then you have on the right the actual Brooks Weir in service. It's actually running water over right that moment in that particular picture. On the left, you see the old Emil Gates. In the old Emil Gates, by the way, it's my understanding that they leaked about 15 million gallons a day of water through there. So moving back to the Brooks Weir that you have there on the right, it actually has helped a great deal with us moving water, but also with the floods circumstances in those areas. And then this is Oyster Creek Dam number 2, which is relatively close to the Brooks Weir structure. It's actually controlled by stop logs and that have to be manually pulled and so forth. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Oyster Creek Dam number 2 in the future and how we can improve that. Upstream and downstream of Oyster Creek Dam number 2, it's actually, you see the amenities that are there. And so on the downstream view, you can see there on the left, there's actually a little head wall and boat docks and that sort of thing. And if you'll remember, you approved a meeting or two ago an encroachment into that area that's very similar to this. So let's move on to the next one. Oyster Creek Dam number 3. Its whole purpose is to hold water back into Oyster Creek, and it allows us the ability to be able to hold that water back and move it into the old second lift. And let's see. This is Oyster Creek Dam number 3 looking upstream, and you can see the amenities. Looking downstream, that's actually a flooded condition on Oyster Creek Dam number 3. In most instances, it's actually relatively dry because I'm told that we hold that water back to move it through our system. And so, again, you have Dam 1 up there on the left, and Ditch H is the overflow, and Brooks Weir provides overflow as well. Dam 2 along the system, and Dam 3, which holds water back for the second lift. And so moving to the next slide, this shows you the actual second lift itself. So you can see Dam number 3 there that we were showing holding the water back. And what it does is it holds the water back so it can go into our A canal system into the second lift itself. So let's move to the next slide. And this is a picture of the second lift itself and the canal system that's associated with that. And the purpose of that is to move water through the entire canal system, and it can serve just almost every one of our customers. However, I do want to point out that we do have a couple of customers that can only be served by this canal, and that's going to be the city of Pearland once they get their water system back up. And also, that's where Manville had planned to do some of their taking of water off of lateral 10. And so, and this is the actual lift, second lift intake as well. So that gets you to essentially the tour of the system. What I want to do is bring your attention back to the area from the Shannon pump station to the old second lift there on the left in the green. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the controversies in this area. And so next slide. So remember I told you we had flooded bridges, and guess what? For those 2 of you that are Fort Bend members, this is not going to come as any news to you that there's people that are very upset out there, and they actually blame us for this flooded condition. And so I think it's very important for us to talk about that a little bit. So let's move to the next slide. So remember I told you that Jones Creek is remarkably complex. So A, again, is the Shannon pump station. It then moves water into that 3.86 mile section of the actual Jones Creek itself. Flu Ellen Creek then ties into it, and then it's 15 more miles down there. That asterisk, by the way, that is pointed out, that's the actual neighborhood that I just showed you where the concerns are. So let's move to the next slide. This is the actual neighborhoods itself. Pecan Creek Estates and Woods Edge subdivisions served by Pecan Street Bridge and Cedar Creek Bridge. And by the way, they are 2 totally separate, distinct subdivisions, and they do not tie in with each other. And so about 3 weeks ago, I was in a meeting, a Zoom meeting, that included neighbors in this area, and it also included a great deal of people from Fort Bend County, including Commissioner Andy Myers. They are trying to work out a solution where the bridges could possibly be reconstructed and how they can gain access and so forth. Essentially not something that we are a part of, but it's something that we should be concerned about. So let's move to the next slide. We're back to that area that we talked about just a little bit ago. This is the source of an enormous amount of confusion, and it's what we refer to as the old second lift. And so here's a couple of the things that people are very confused about. Let's go back to where we have the Jones Creek spillway in that orange colored box. You see the little trail down through there. Most people don't know that exists, and most people actually don't even know the Jones Creek Spillway exists because it's actually relatively hard to see from the roadway. And so in many instances, the people that are out there think Jones Creek is actually a tributary of Oyster Creek, and it is not. Jones Creek is a tributary of the Brazos River, and that little tiny trail that goes off down there where it says Goldenrod Estates, that's actually Jones Creek. And so those that do know that it's there refer to it as the escape channel, and that's absolutely not what it is. And so if you move up to the yellow box area, that's where the Skinner Gates are. And the Skinner Gates, there's a lot of people who think that that is actually a flood control structure. And a lot of the folks out there actually thought that the disrepair that I showed you in an earlier slide was the problem. And that's not the case at all. Again, it's not a flood control structure. The other thing that's very, very confusing is that when it is incredibly wet out there and water is running down through there, we actually close those gates. And we only crack them open a short amount. And we crack them open a short amount because remember that the Pecan Grove water treatment plant needs 1.6 million gallons a day. Well, we're moving 1.6 million gallons a day down Oyster Creek to feed Pecan Grove, but it not being a flood control structure, we don't operate it that way. But then when the sun is shining and it is not raining and we're moving a lot of water through there, we open those gates up quite a bit and a lot of water runs through there, and they think that we are not operating the system correctly. So let's move to the next one. So I want to, before we get into the next few slides, I want to give you an update, a reminder on the legislation that we have on the Gulf Coast Water Authority that's relevant. Section 3B, our authority is to store, transport, and deliver water. And by the way, there's about 10 other things, but this is what's directly relevant to our drainage and flooding. And Section 4A says we have no authority to control stormwater. Now that's heavily paraphrased, but I'll tell you that there's no wiggle room in Section 4A at all. We have no authority to control stormwater at all.
Let me interrupt and ask a question. That section specifically says we cannot control stormwater. Is that right, or is it?
That's correct. We have no authority.
So it's not just we don't have any authority, but we're prohibited.
Yes, that's a good point, Russell. We are very explicitly prohibited, and I would invite you to actually go through and read that section because it is painfully clear that we are prohibited. Section 4B, it essentially says that the various districts around retain all of their authority. So there is a conservation and reclamation district there, Fort Bend County Drainage, and the cities and so forth, they have authority to handle drainage. We do not, and they retain their authority. And Section 4F says that we're subject to the authority of the state, and we have various different permits and so forth and so on. And so we are strictly focused on transporting water. So let's move to the next slide. So again, just reminding everybody, we're on Jones Creek. What I have done is I've added a couple of things in there. I've added to the north a bit that Fluellen Creek, and I've shown that in red going down through there. I've also added to this the downstream of Jones Creek that is mistakenly called the Jones Creek, is mistakenly called the escape channel. And so I think this next slide is really going to start to provide you the information that you need to know about all of this. And you may have to look real closely, but if you look on the left where the confluence of Fluellen Creek is with Jones Creek, there is a little X and it says 76. Well, that's the elevation out there. Now let's move all the way over to the Skinner Gates where it says Old Second Lift. It says 73.4 feet. There is less than 3 feet of fall. Now I want to make that real clear. There is less than 3 feet of elevation distance in that very lengthy section of the creek of fall in that area. Now let's have a look at Fluellen Creek that provides water to that. This is Fluellen Creek, and by the way, this is the watershed that's associated with it, and it's a little hard to see, but up there at the very top of that watershed is actually the Waller and Fort Bend County line. And so if you look up there, you have 182 feet on that X right there, and if you'll remember, 76 feet down there in the Jones Creek confluence of it. So what you have there is about 100 feet of fall from the top of that watershed down to the Jones Creek watershed, at which point it immediately transitions into something that has less than 3 feet of fall in 18 creek miles. That is an amazing amount of things. And so if you've ever played with drainage or looked at drainage and that sort of thing, it doesn't matter how many detention ponds you put in place, and it actually helps a great deal. But once that water hits into Fluellen Creek, has no choice but to essentially go roaring down through there. And when it roars down through there and it hits Jones Creek, it has no possibility of doing anything but spreading all over everywhere. So let's go to the next slide. So this gives you a little bit closer view of it. The headwaters up there is 120. That's the headwaters of the creek, but that doesn't include everything that delivers to it. And so I also want to point out on the bottom right, that green channel through there, that is actually Jones Creek, where that water should be going. So let's go to the next slide. So what I had our folks do is go on the week, essentially, of that flood and pull out our pumpage records. And so they were most concerned on June the 24th, on Wednesday. So I want to point out on Monday, on the 22nd, see where it says P1 in running hours? Well, we ran the pump from midnight to 11 a.m. that day, and we turned the pumps off. And every single pump was off all through the rest of that week. Now, David Sauer and David Hudson tell me that it takes 12 to 24 hours for the water to pulse from the Shannon pump station all the way to the Skinner gates. So what that tells me is that there was not a single drop of our water in that system when it flooded. Not a single drop. And I think that is remarkably important. We are not the issue associated with this. And by the way, remember I mentioned that we're putting through about 100 or so cubic feet per second. Well, those flooded bridges are more closely related to 1,500 cubic feet per second of water. And so I also want to show you a little bit about what the potential solution is, and actually the only solution that I am aware of. So remember, again, you got Fluellen Creek coming down into the green area, and there's the little asterisk with the neighborhood. Well, the solution is that Jones Creek and Oyster Creek, let's move to the next slide. The solution is Jones Creek and Oyster Creek are almost exactly the same. Only Oyster Creek's problem has been solved, and the solving of Oyster Creek's problem is Ditch H and the Ditch H overflow and the Brooks Weir, because all of that water, before it ever even gets into Sugar Land, is diverted out into Ditch H and goes right straight to the Brazos River. So let's go to the next one. The next slide has an aerial view of it, and I just wanted you to be able to see that from an aerial standpoint. And to the next slide. So the true solution to this is actually a Fluellen Creek bypass as well, much like Ditch H. And what has to happen is that water has to go to the Brazos River before it ever even gets into the system, because you're not going to be able to move water through a system that only has a couple of feet of fall, and it is always going to spread out. And even if we turned all of our pumps off and went away, it's still going to flood like this. And so the end result of this and our approach, and let's move to the next slide, is that we are not authorized to do drainage. As Russell pointed out, we are explicitly prohibited from doing drainage, but we affect drainage and we're affected by drainage. And so in this particular result, we're yielding to Fort Bend County Drainage District on drainage pumping matters, on drainage related matters. And what we do to mitigate it is that we mitigate by shutting down our pumps when we know it's going to rain. And so our folks are constantly out there looking and monitoring and that sort of thing, the rain, and they actively shut pumps down under those circumstances. And the issue is related to an increased frequency and intensity of rains. And by the way, the guys at Fort Bend Drainage District say that since they've been keeping records for the last 80 to 100 years, that the 10 most intense rainstorms that have happened, 7 of them have happened in the last 10 years. And so you have a greatly increased frequency and intensity of rains, and Fluellen Creek, which is always going to be providing water down through that system. And so with that, I know that was a quick tour, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, but the bottom line is there's nothing that's compelling us that we have to do something here to resolve this problem.
There is not. And I want to point out, Russell, that for us saying we'll do whatever Fort Bend tells us to do. The couple of things that I want to point out with that is that Costello Engineers has done a drainage model of this area. And while they were working on that model, they actually removed the Jones Creek spillway entirely from the model just to see how the Jones Creek would behave. And the answer they got was the amount of elevation fall in Jones Creek where those bridges are that are flooded. Well, what he said was 3/100ths of a foot. Well, 3/100ths of a foot, when you start talking about a drainage model, is a ridiculous number. It's actually meaningless. What it means is that it provides no help whatsoever. In addition to that, we could turn around and say if Fort Bend County Flood Control wants us to open the Skinner Lane gates and let water go through, we will work with them on that. That's a ridiculous statement. We can't do that. We can't help with drainage. Those gates would not exist were it not for us. And we are not authorized to do it, and they are not authorized to move water from one drainage basin to another drainage basin. And by moving the water into that area, the only thing that it would do is provide more of a pressure on ditch H. And instead of that solution, the true solution is to go back there with some sort of Fluellen Creek bypass to the Brazos River.
And I was at a meeting 1.5 years or so ago of another group of folks that are out there, and Fort Bend County engineer was there at that time, and he basically said, as I recall, that this outfall that you just described as being the solution was the only solution he was aware of that could be done. And and he says it's a huge project, and that he tells me that it's on Fort Bend County's maybe someday we'll do it list. It's not like a
problem that
plan.
Yes, sir. The problem that they face out there is that ditch H, Russell, as you mentioned, was constructed by a developer and is actually maintained and so forth by a levee improvement district and so forth. The area of Jones Creek that we've been looking at is not in a city, and it's not in any sort of special flood district. And so without them being in their own special flood district, they are at the mercy of the entirety of Fort Bend County. And so if they put out some sort of a bond to do work out there, the entirety of Fort Bend County would have to be in favor of doing that. And what I heard at that meeting that I went to is that where the basic big populations are in Fort Bend County, they all have their own levee improvement districts and various other things, taxing districts. And to look at this area that does not have its own taxing district and that sort of thing, it's going to be a hard sell for them to rely wholly on Fort Bend County. And it was recommended to them again at that meeting that if they're truly serious about fixing this problem, that they need to form their own sort of flood control district in that area, and they need to do it quickly, because that area south of Fulshire is developing like crazy, and their opportunity to have that channel opening through there is going to be slowly closing on a daily basis with development.
What was the response to developing a drainage district?
Oh, they didn't respond to that at all. It essentially was a non-starter for them. But I will tell you that I took this sort of presentation, but it only consisted of a few slides because they are familiar with that particular area, and I was able to show them very clearly that we were not the culprit in that particular location.
How does Fort Bend Drainage District view it? Do they view it the way you're presenting it on the slide?
Yes.
They are responsible for drainage?
Right. What they are responsible for drainage, but what they have said is that the maintenance that they do is in areas where they have easements, and that they are not really in the business, at least right this minute, of doing major capital improvements. They do developmental control and they do maintenance, but if the major capital improvements are essentially done by drainage and flood districts in that area that are not them. And by the way, I had a lengthy discussion with the folks at Fort Bend Drainage District prior to my discussions with the neighborhood out there, and we are 100% on the same page with this.
What about having a drainage district?
Well, about how this functions, and I have had subsequent phone calls with folks out there and have advised them that continuing to blame us, they're wasting their time, and that they really, really need to be focusing on that Fluellen channel before development closes up. And I'll be happy to sit in front of any group and show them that as well that would like to invite me in Fort Bend County.
What is our role? What is our role, or what skin in the game do we have related to this?
What is our role in the area?
Yeah, or what is our role related to this? I mean, do we have any skin in the game?
Well, the skin that we have in the game is that we have had rights to move water through that area since 1908. And we have the rights not only through easements, but the rights through TCEQ permits and so forth. And we move in the neighborhood of 100 to 200 cubic feet per second of water through there. And that provides that very lovely amenity that they've all gotten used to in that pretty creek. But moving water through that area is the only thing that we are responsible for, and we do maintain by clearing out that channel bottom from time to time. And actually, Fort Bend Drainage has been very complimentary of us, because they've essentially told all of those folks out there they don't have a drainage easement through that area, therefore they don't maintain it. So were it not for us clearing out that channel to continue our water through there, that whole channel would be completely choked full because they don't maintain it. Just like they don't maintain
Jones?
Yes, just like they don't maintain Jones Creek below the spillway. That area is choked with trees, and they don't have easements for it, and they're not touching it.
Brandon, do we, I know if we talk about, or if we promote somebody to want to do some kind of a bypass, do we know what kind of effects it has, the amount of water it puts into our system? Like, would that adversely affect us by having to pump more, or is it minimal?
Well, one of the things that we all agree on, including the Fort Bend Drainage folks, is that if they were to do something like that, it would require a very special channel operation through their passive channel operation through there that would allow our water to move through on a daily basis like it would normally do, but would function as a bypass when the floods get up. And so that would have to be designed at some time in the future. But the fact that we are there, they have to design around that. I appreciate your attention to that very long presentation, but I think it's very important for all of us to know how Jones and Oyster Creek works. And it's very important, at least for the Fort Bend County appointees, to know for a fact we are not responsible for their problem.
Well, Brandon, I heard that you did an excellent job in your presentation. And
Thank you.
I wanted to follow up with, did you work it out where, is this presentation going to be on our site or even on the commissioner's website?
Well,
just as a resource?
What I'm working out right now is that we're going to attempt to condense this very large presentation into something much more digestible for individuals. And we are going to put it on our website. I will certainly contact others to see if I can encourage them to do so. One other thing, you may know Danny in our GIS section. Danny has actually taken this very 1990s presentation that I've done and turned it into a modern presentation where you'll be able to go onto an aerial photo with numbers and so forth and click on it, and it will pop all of this information up. And he actually had prepared a good bit of this, but I'm a little too old school to have been able to navigate it. But we will make sure that that we get this on the website. I'm also going to make sure that Kathy Thomas understands this, and she can help us with putting this into a much more digestible form.
I think it was very well done, Brandon. You scared me when you said 62 slides, but it flowed very well.
Yeah.
It made me think too. I wonder if having a recording of essentially what you just went through, sort of walking through this, would be of benefit to
Well,
have on our website.
I'm going to ask
Perfect.
Renee, because we actually do record these things, and see if we can get someone to help us clip this out and make this into a separate presentation. And so it can actually go on our website, but it can also be a part of the, remember, I've talked to a few of you about doing a GCWA 101 course where we have certain bits of basic information that we record that new board members will be able to look at. And I think that this can be a good start for that.
Brandon, I'd request that you see if you can get in contact with Morgan Freeman and see if he can do a narrative of this, because I think it would be great.
Funny. We'll give it a shot.
That will come straight out of Brad's budget.
Excellent. Well, once again, I truly do appreciate your attention to this. I think it's this has been fascinating for me, and I'm not sure that this sort of situation exists in many other locations in the United States, and so it's been a great thing to have a look at.